Hey, solopreneurs. Today we have Reverend Dr. Terrlyn Curry Avery, or TLC, of Sacred Intelligence, LLC. Terrlyn is a pastologist, and she is a transformational leader, coach, speaker, author, and retreat leader. Terrlyn has a new book coming out called Dismantling Racism. Actually, the actual title might actually be Dismantle Racism, but you'll hear about that as we go through the interview. And I think you are going to love hearing her story. Terrlyn, thank you for being on the podcast.
Oh, Gabe, I'm so excited to be here.
Good. I have to say I'm excited for you to be in this coaching podcast. You have got a book coming out called Dismantling Racism, and you're going to talk with us about how to be more inclusive, how to help us expand our businesses and be, for lack of a put it, more racially diverse and inclusive. But before we get there, I got to hear your story. I mean, and the first thing I'm going to start off with is I'm going to start off with this word called pastologist. Can you tell me what a pastologist is, if you would, please?
Well, yes, I'm delighted to, because pastologist is actually a phrase that I coined, and it comes from the fact that I am a licensed psychologist, and I have been a psychologist for a number of years. And then God, I refer to the sacred as God, this humorous thing, and called me to become a pastor. And I was like, what? Why? Why do I need to become a pastor? And I really felt like I was already serving by being a licensed psychologist. And in due time, what I've come to realize is that I merge my gifts as a psychologist and as a spiritual leader. And I coined the phrase pastologist. So that's the work that I do in terms of helping people to heal and to be the best that they can be in all levels of their lives, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, all of it.
So thank you for that. And I remember even when I did my research and I got introduced to you, I saw that pastologist, and I really appreciate you sharing that, because I'm like, what the heck is a pastologist? And so now I get it. But you started out off as a psychologist first. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, I do.
Okay. And what led you down that path? What brought you into the psychology world?
I I really have just always loved helping people. And I was one of those people when I graduated from high school. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I loved helping people. And when I got to college, that's when I realized that psychology was really what I wanted to do. And I'm a person who helps folks no matter what. I love giving and giving and giving. That sometimes has its problems as well, but we'll talk about that later. And for me, as a woman of color, one of the things that I really wanted to do was to work with kids of color. I wanted to work with kids who were in the inner city. Now, never mind that I grew up in a southern state in a small town and didn't know very much about what it meant to work with inner city kids, but I just knew that I wanted to. And I knew the importance also, as a person of color, wanting to do something where I could serve my people. And so for years, I did that. For years, I worked as an adolescent psychologist in a juvenile delinquent facility. And then I worked in a public high school. I worked at a psychiatric institution. And in all those areas, there was always this common thread that was running through, which I could see where there would be differences in the ways in which children of color were treated versus white kids were treated. And so that also began my work. Well, actually, it didn't begin my work of dismantling racism. That has been my lifelong thing. But it began this process of where I would also do training, even while I was serving as a psychologist. So in my private practice, maybe I didn't see as quite as many students of color because of my part of town that I live in, but I still continue to do that work, and I would just train people on dismantling racism. So I've been at it for quite a while.
Yeah, interesting. So, and you had your own private practice. How many years have you had your own private practice? And is that still going, or?
I do more coaching now than I do. I have maybe one or two clients that I will see, but yeah, that's a whole nother issue with private practice. And because you're a money man, you might appreciate all the ups and downs that happens when you have to depend on someone else paying you your money and billing and all of those things. But I know you'll talk about that much later in the show. But now my work is really more on dismantling racism. And one of the other things that I do as a pastologist is try to help heal the wounds of religion. And of course, there's some I won't say correlation, but I think that we'll find that there are some wounds of religion that are really steeped in racism as well, though that was not where I started out with the wounds of religion, but there's overlap. So
Interesting. Can share a little more about that, if you would? The wounds of religion, and then the psychology coming together. I got to go back though. You had said something about you had this kind of like this. You said God was being kind of funny, like calling you into this. Everybody has a different call. What was that like for you?
So, really interesting. I feel like God had been calling me for a very long time, but I was one of those people who were like, no, I'm not, I don't want to do ministry. People would say to me out of the blue, have you ever thought about becoming a pastor? And I would say, no, I've not. Maybe God has. I haven't. That's not me. But here's the story. I actually was sitting one day at a women's retreat, and this pastor began to do this sermon called Can You Hear Me Now? Now, mind you, I had just had this conversation with God. I said, all right, God, maybe you are calling me. And maybe one day, years from now, I'll answer the call. But for right now, I'm going to continue to be a psychologist, and I'm going to work with these adolescents because I love working with adolescents. So I got you, God, just a little bit down the road. So I go to this women's retreat, and I'm sitting there minding my business. And she starts preaching this sermon, and it was called Can You Hear Me Now? And it was based on that Verizon commercial. So I'm just listening intently, and she's very just, mild mannered. And she said, when God called me to become a pastor, I said, okay, God, I will work with you down the road when I'm about 50 years old. And I was like, what? I just kind of had that conversation with God. And she went on to talk about how God just kept, penetrating her mind and blah, blah, blah. And then she would say, can you hear me now? And as she kept saying, can you hear me now? The strangeness started to happen in my body, because then the next thing she said was, I was going to be a child and adolescent psychologist. I was like, okay, what, God? Like, really, really, God? So she just kept talking, and she kept punctuating her sentences with, can you hear me now? Well, needless to say, I was a wreck by the time she was done. Now, you couldn't tell because I'm cool, calm, and collected. But afterwards, she says, she comes over. I don't know how she happened to be in my view after that, after she was done preaching, end of the plenary. And I say, well, I really need to talk with you, but we can talk later because I'm all shook up in the inside. I'm not ready to go have this conversation. And I think she must have seen terror on my face, because she says, no, come now, Terrlyn, come and talk to me. So I go into her suite, and I just start sobbing. Now, anyone who's listening to this story, I don't cry very easily at all, but I'm sobbing and I'm going, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know. And she's like, Terrlyn, you know. I'm like, what do you know? I don't know. And so I just say to her, I say, listen, I believe God is calling me to become a pastor. And the first words out of her mouth were, Terrlyn, I'm not surprised, because she knew me. And I must say, I told two other pastors after that, and they each said the same thing. Terrlyn, I'm not surprised. And I just could not imagine, what is it that God wanted me to do? I said to her, I'm already serving as a psychologist. What more does God want? And she asked me simply to think about, what can you do as an ordained minister that you can't do as a psychologist? And so as I continued my journey, I started getting more and more people in my practice who had been wounded by religion. Not necessarily the race piece, but it was more of people who were LGBTQIA, folks who really had pastors who had taken advantage of them sexually, mentally, emotionally, folks who had a warped way of thinking around money issues. I know that's your thing,
Mm-hmm.
but um, just all of these things. And I kept thinking, okay, God, I got you. And it made a difference that I had a degree in theology and that I was an ordained minister, because then my clients could hear me differently. Because those people who had the wounds of religion, they really wanted to come back to this place of trusting God and believing in God, but they didn't trust the system. They didn't trust going into a religious institution. So they got someone who was a psychologist and a pastor. And I never, ever proselytize. I never try to get people to come over to my way of thinking. I use what they have and I connect them with their higher self. And I use the term the sacred because I think it's all inclusive, even though for me, I refer to the sacred as God. But in my work, and that's how I came up with sacred intelligence, is really about tapping into the sacred part of you and understanding that you're divinely created and loved unconditionally. So that was the work that I was doing, really starting to focus on that until 2020 erupted and I had to return to some of my work on dismantling racism.
Right. And thank you very much for sharing that story. That is awesome. Um, B, I have a cousin who is a Methodist pastor,
Mhm.
and he's my age, and we grew up kind of together, kind of not, and every now and then we'd catch back up together. And I remember he was always the one who told all the dirty jokes. He was the one who was always getting in trouble. He was the one who was always doing things that were a little on the edge. And then all of a sudden he tells me, "Yeah, I'm going to be a pastor." I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah."
Yeah.
I've been fighting this call for years. And then he told me the story how when he finally gave in, he goes, "I can still remember. I pulled my feet off of the bed. I woke up in the morning. I pulled my feet off, put them on the floor." And he goes, "I can still remember the feeling of the floor when I finally said,
Mhm.
'Okay, God, I
Yeah.
will do this.'"
Yes.
And he's got a fantastic church. I mean, and the stories. I mean, you take a guy who was always telling dirty jokes. Well, he's not afraid to have fun with the kids. I mean, he's not afraid to just get in there. And one of the stories I heard, and then we'll go back into the ABC, and then we'll move on. But one of the stories I remember hearing is when he was in the training, he started to step in as like a youth pastor at their church, and he would call the kids at home on Wednesdays before they're supposed to show up for the Wednesday, youth group. Like, "Hey, you better get there today. Come on now, I'm watching you." And this was a little small town. He goes, "I can see you're home. You need to come to church tonight." So I mean, he was one of those guys that was just, I bet he just absolutely had a blast with the kids, but then this connection and it pretty neat stuff. So thanks for sharing that story. B, I wanted to share that because it's interesting. I'm always just intrigued by the call. I always like to know that. It's interesting after my cousin told me that. And then C, you just said something that then you had a twist. You had a change in your life that happened. And now when 2020 hit, now you're really focused on the dismantling racism and then the things that are coming, which I would assume has a little bit to do maybe with the build up to your book. Did that all kind of come together?
It has everything to do with the buildup of my book because, interestingly enough, I was working with a book coach and I was going to do a book first on the wounds of religion. So this is how crazy this is, right? So I said, okay, I got to do this book on the wounds of religion because that's a whole nother radio show podcast for us. And then COVID hit. So the people in the coaching group said, Terrlyn, why don't you do a book on faith? Because we need to know how to get through faith during this corona virus. Well, I had done a sermon, and I say this in my book. I was doing a series on faith for the people in my congregation around COVID. The first Sunday after I had done my series, George Floyd was murdered. And from that, the world sort of erupted. And the people in my group started talking to me about, like, Terrell, we actually need a story. You should be writing something on racism, because they knew I had done work in the past. I didn't just wake up one day and say, oh, you know what, I'm Black, so I'm going to start doing this training. I had been doing it for years, but I put it aside when I thought God was calling me to do the work on the wounds of religion. And I can recall my girlfriend saying to me some years ago, Terrlyn, yes, you're called to do the wounds of religion, but all of these Black men and women who are being killed by the police, you're a spiritual leader. You have to speak out about this. And I was like, no, that's for somebody else to do. Well, fast forward to 2020, George Floyd is murdered. I'm in the process of writing the book. I have my colleagues wanting to know, Terrlyn, how do we deal with this? And then I have my children. So if I could share another story with you, and it's in my book. So I had just finished doing this first series. There were three sermons I was doing. I had just finished doing the first one. I went to several protests that week. But what happened was my kids were going to a protest. And they were going to go without me because it was on a Sunday. And I was in church, even though it was via Zoom, I was in church. And thank God that we finished church in order for me to go with them. And so I go to this protest with them, and I'm saying to them, girls, we're still in coronavirus. Don't get too close to people. Wear your mask, blah, blah, blah. But as a Black woman, it was important for me to go with my children to this protest because I didn't know what would happen. We saw across the nation tear gas being thrown at people, police force. We saw rioting, looting. I didn't know what they would experience. And so for me, as a Black woman, it was important for me to be with them. And so I go, and we get there. Nobody is doing anything. People are just standing around. And so the girls were like, Mom, go up there and get it started. And I'm like, I didn't start this. Look, I'm just here. So they're like, but Mom, go get it started. So I walk over to this gentleman and I say to him, who's starting this? We're just standing around. And he said, I don't know, but if you go up there, I got your back. Well, I got your back meant that he was going to record me while I went up there. And so, long story short, I go up, I get it started, and I started talking to them about the importance of us dismantling racism. It was a group of white and Black and Latina, all nationalities were there. And so I talked to them and gave them statistics around disparities that exist. So because I'm educated in that area, I could go up and talk from a place of knowledge as well as action. And the thing that was really powerful to me as a mom, when I got back in the car, my girls said to me, Mom, I was shaking while you were up there. And I kept thinking, that's my mom. And so in my book, I talk about that and I say, I don't get to opt out. And if you are a transformational leader, you don't get to opt out of this conversation on race. And you don't have to be an expert to do it. But one of the things you can do is come to someone like me who can train you on ways in which you have the conversation. But it is important for us as leaders to know that we have the capability of doing this work, but to know that our young people are watching us, and to also know that we can change lives when we choose to step up to the plate and manifest the best of who we are. And also, God has already equipped us to do the work. That's the important thing. It's about recognizing it.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that story. I'll take it all the way down to the basic. When your kids look at you and say, "That's my mom," I mean, that right there. That no matter how much your knees were knocking when you walked up there, it didn't matter. That was
Yeah.
powerful. Yeah,
Yes.
good for you. Good for you. That is awesome. Let's transition into a little bit of the like the information that's in your book, but also you touched on something that come to you for the training to help teach how to, or let me rephrase that, to learn how to have the conversation, to learn, and that's the topic of the podcast today, is to how to become more racially inclusive, to how to dismantle the racism. What are some of the things that my listeners can take away? I mean, what are some of the things that you can share from your expertise and your years of work in this area that would help, ultimately these solopreneurs who are listening, be more inclusive, which then ultimately is going to help them grow their businesses and make a bigger impact in the world.
Yes, and it's important that they know that, because if you aren't aware of how you are unintentionally perpetuating racism and unintentionally not driving people of color to your business, then you cannot be aware of how much money you're leaving on the table. So, in my book, just real briefly, there are three parts that I talk about, because anything that I talk about in my work, I'm always talking about our sacred relationship, our selfish relationship, and our shared relationship. Because to me, that's the basis of our sacred intelligence. And what that is really taking a look at going inward to tap into that divine source of who we are, so that we can make decisions that are going to be good for us and good for other people as well. So it's not about completely just me, 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 me. So, what do I mean then? So, if we look at our sacred relationship as it relates to dismantling racism, one of the things that I talk about is our sacred motive, understanding why you want to be more inclusive in the first place. And I write the book in terms of talking about, I use faith, so I didn't veer too far away from the faith. It's not a proselytizing book, let me just say this, but to have faith in your sacred source, faith in your divine wisdom. You don't have to have a religion that you practice, but what is the internal thing that drives you? Because when we do this work on dismantling racism, it's got to be more than guilt or shame or frustration or anger, which was a huge thing. I had a lot of white people who came to me who said, "I'm really angry about what's happening in this country," and didn't know what to do with it. So in my book, I talk about dealing first with your anger and the emotions that are associated with this conversation around race, and understanding why you want to be inclusive. So you go into your own divine wisdom and figure out what's your sacred motive, what's your why. Gabe, a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of corporations changed their mission statement after George Floyd was murdered and the protest happened. A lot of people said they wanted to become more inclusive. But what we found when we look at the data is that those numbers are dropping the farther away we get from 2020. So I invite your listeners to really think about what's your motive for wanting to do this work? What's your personal motive and what's your professional motive? So in my courses, I talk from this place of our shared humanity and this place of love. Yes, I do offer that, because I really talk about it may sound kind of woo to people, but we're all in this thing together, Gabe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I am because you are, and you are because I am. Ubuntu. And so that is a Ghanaian word, I believe it's Ghanaian word that refers to just us being interconnected. And if I'm wrong, people, in terms of it being Ghanaian, please don't hold me uh, uh, too accountable for it. But I do know that it is from Africa. And I love that thought, because as a people, as particularly as an African American, We believe in helping one another out. So the first thing then is that sacred motive. Then there's the selfish mind piece. Now, what do I mean by selfish? I mean the work that each of us must do to transform ourselves. Because when we transform ourselves, then we are able to help other people. So, if we're going to talk about dismantling racism, people have to ask themselves the questions, things like, what am I doing to dismantle racism? You know, why didn't I see race and racism before? Because a lot of people were very angry, saying we were not taught properly in school. And I'm thinking, yes, but why didn't you answer the question? Ask the question, right? But the selfish mind piece is about knowing that we are able to do this work. It doesn't matter what color you are. It's about examining yourself to figure out what's the mindset that's keeping you from stepping into this next form of leadership. Are you worried about what your colleagues will say? Are you worried that you don't know how to have the conversation? And so, what I do is I'm going to tell you, it's not a how to like that I'm giving you all the answers, but I'm inviting you to take a look at yourself in the book. And I'm asking corporations to take a look at their data, to take a look at how many people of color have you hired, even entrepreneurs, solo entrepreneurs. How many people do you hire to support you? Where are you going to get those people when you do interviews? Where are you going to find the people that you'd like to interview for those positions? Are you going into places that are frequented by people of color? So I asked some very basic questions because the way I laid out the book, and I'm a psychologist by training, so I'm always thinking of the questions. I ask about 4 or 5 questions at the end of each section to get folks thinking about how they can become more engaged. And then finally, this is long, but it's the shared movement. What do we do in order to move forward collectively? How do you take the learning that you have from your selfish mindset and now take it into your corporation? What do you need to do? How do you have the conversation about race in a way that does not alienate white folks, but also supports people of color? And then how do you have a conversation with a person of color that perhaps you want to help them to develop, but you're scared that if you say the wrong thing, they'll be offended? And so, it's about having the courage to move forward and to trust your divine wisdom that it will lead you down a path where you will be able to lead your organization with courage and with commitment.
That's fantastic. And so, what I'm hearing then is I'm hearing the sacred motive, which is the why,
Mm-hmm.
the selfish motive, and the
So it's
shared
selfish
motive, and
mindset, which is changing,
selfish minds.
yeah, changing the way we think.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's changing the way we think. So we have to really get back and think about why we're doing, even all the way down to the basics of our whole existence in this world. Why are we here? What are we doing? And then start to have the conversation with ourselves as to why I am doing this and why I'm going to consider, for lack of put it, on our topic, to be more racially inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, I'm gonna jump all the way towards the end of it to make sure I'm on the same page with you. Is to have the courage to step forward, and then I love that, your courage, and then the trust that
Yes.
we're in this together. We're trying to figure this out. And because I might say the wrong thing, or you might say the wrong thing, the idea is that we're really just trying to, for lack of put it, help each other out as we move through this process.
And if I could just say one thing, a part of the selfish mindset, and as it relates to faith, it really is about faith in yourself and faith in your higher source that you're not walking this path alone. And I talk about some of the pain that's associated with doing this work because it doesn't feel good to me either sometimes when I have to do this work. As a matter of fact, for most people of color, when they're doing this work, it's very emotional for us and we have to keep it in check. We have to be able to listen to the things that people say that might sound really crazy, but we have to be at our highest level of consciousness and say, okay, I'm just listening. I'm just in listening mode. And how can I serve in this moment? It's tough work, but I want to encourage your listeners. That's where the faith in you being equipped to do this work comes in. And what we don't know, we get help with. So if your divine source and your inner wisdom is saying, I want to do something to dismantle racism and to become more racially inclusive, we have to trust that source to put the right teachers in our path and for us to connect with those parts of ourselves that will allow us to do this work. And that means that we have to take a look at ourselves. And it's hard to take a look at the ways in which we perpetuated racism.
Oh, totally.
And people, and so just go with it. Go with it. Deal with the pain and the discomfort of the moment. And I promise you, you're going to feel so much better on the other side of this. And you're going to be able to have more people of color to work with you in your businesses, to trust you in terms of saying, Gabe looks like somebody I can talk to about finances. I can trust him. And that's huge.
Yeah, very huge. So, what would be a first step? Obviously, the first step is someone needs to buy your book. That's the first thing. So we need to get your book, and then what would be aside from getting your mindset around the fact that, hey, I have got to make some changes to where I'm going and what I'm doing. What would be a first step for my listeners to take?
You know what a simple first step is? So, because there are some people who still kind of think, why are we making such a big deal about race and racism? And so I would invite your listeners to open up their minds and to become more aware, because that's what I do when I'm teaching. Is the first thing I have people to do is to become aware of the ways in which implicit biases show up and become aware of the ways in which um, racism shows up in our lives. And so we might take a look at something like health disparities, for instance. And I know a lot of people, they may not be interested in that, but you might say, well, let's take a look at why are perhaps people of color less likely to get the COVID-19 vaccine?
Mm-hmm.
And then we might say, well, why is there why are they skeptic about this? And then we could take a look at history and take a look and say, oh yeah, there was a study that was done in the 60s where they intentionally injected folks with syphilis, black people, black men with syphilis. So that might be a reason why black people don't trust the system. So a lot of people may not take a look at that because they might say, well, I'm not going to go all the way back in history. Well, I'll give you something that you can look at, something that happens on a daily basis. When you begin to ask yourself the question, when you see a black man or a woman shot in the back, when they have their hands up, ask yourself simply the question, why don't we see white people getting shot in the back with their hands up? And it's been my experience that white people who are friends with me, in fact, who will say, well, I just don't understand why they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And I'll say, what, did you see them with their hands up? So that's the first thing. I would say, ask yourself the question, what does race have to do with this? It's a common question to ask about anything that we do. So if we're in a neighborhood where there are all white people in the neighborhood, ask yourself the question, what does race have to do with my neighborhood? Why are there all white people in this neighborhood? Why haven't we integrated? So that's one thing. The second thing, of course, is I would say, take a look at the courses that I offer. And I am more than happy to have you come and to join any of my courses. But you can also start reading books. You can watch shows and movies that have the counter story to them, because there are lots of things that perpetuate the stereotypes. But there are a number of documentaries out here that will give us a really objective look at some of the things that have been going on in this country. So I'll stop for there, because as you see, Gabe, I can just keep going.
I love it. Absolutely love it. I'm for some reason I am not remembering the name of the podcast, but my wife pulled out a podcast and it was done by the New York Times. It was called 16 something, and it was about the history.
19.
1619. Yes. And it was a New York Times. It was a podcast that I listened to, and it was fantastic. And it was very, very educational. And I mean, I'm a 49-year-old white guy. I mean, grew up in the Midwest. And so this was information that I had not sought out myself, but it was also information that I hadn't learned growing up. And it was just very insightful, and it was very interesting. But it also, and I think, what causes people maybe to hesitate is it makes us uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Is unfortunately what happens, and not everybody's willing to go through that uncomfortableness and have the courage and the trust, like we talked about, to go through. So I've loved hearing all of this, and we could just keep right on a rolling.
We could. But I just want to encourage your listeners. You can't be serious about dismantling racism or being racially inclusive if you're not going to be uncomfortable. And there are lots of days that I'm uncomfortable when I walk around just living in this society, when I'm driving through a white neighborhood like I was a few weeks back, and my daughter stopped because she wanted to take a picture of a rainbow. And this man comes out of his house and takes a picture of us. I was like, girl, let's get out of here before they call. And we're not doing anything.
Yeah.
We just happened to be going through the neighborhood trying to get back on a highway. And she saw a beautiful, beautiful rainbow. Shouldn't she be able to stop and take a picture of the rainbow? But what I always say to people, and I really want your listeners to hear this, because folks worry about saying the wrong thing. And this is the famous line that I always say to white folks. I had to learn how to navigate whiteness. You need to learn how to navigate Blackness now. We all have to figure out this game of life that we're in. Deal with the discomfort. You would not be where you are as a transformational leader if you didn't go through something uncomfortable. Why should this be any differently? And I also want to say that for me, I can only speak for me as a Black woman, that if I can see that you're genuinely trying, my response to you isn't going to be one that makes you feel shame or guilt or any of that. It really is going to be us having a dialogue. And that's one of the things that I've heard people say who've taken my classes, is that they feel safe in the class because I'm going to make you uncomfortable. As a matter of fact, the very thing in my class that I know that you might be struggling with, it could be a conversation that you're struggling with having. We're going to do that role play. And we're going to role play in front of everybody so that you can get used to the conversation. Because we don't have to fear race. We don't have to fear race, but we do have to dismantle racism. And by the way, race is a made up construct, but we use it because it's the context in which we live in.
Very good. Very good. And I have to just piggyback on that just a little bit. The whole idea, and all solopreneurs understand this, in order to get anywhere of comfort, you have to go through uncomfortableness.
Yes.
You've got to, I just heard it the other day, you got to get off the couch of comfort to become great.
Yeah.
And this is the same. We need to get ourselves off the couch of comfort to be great and to be more inclusive and to just, frankly, have a better world, to really be a little pie in the sky. But yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to make the little twist here now. Terrlyn, we've got 3 questions. This is a podcast about money, and there's 3 questions that I ask every single person. And the first question is what is the smartest thing you've ever done regarding money, and what is that story?
Well, the smartest thing I feel like I've done regarding money is to hire a coach, a business coach who could help me with my business. And the reason why it was smart because it was the right time. You go to school, you spend all this time, you become a psychologist, being in school forever, then in school for ministry. And I had my private practice. And so I was pastoring and doing the business on the side, even while I was doing my private practice. So basically, 3 different things. And I knew I needed to get someone who could help me figure out how to best utilize my time, my energy, and to be able then to make the money that I wanted to make while I served people. And I have to tell you that when I hired this coach, I was at a place in my life where I knew that I was getting ready to separate from my husband. So I knew that finances were going to be, you know, kind of different at that point. And I knew I wanted to work with her. And I had this private practice where I was paying a lot of money. And I said, what can I do to afford her? Because she's who I need to work with. And so I stepped out on faith because that's a big part for me. And it turns out that the place where I was leasing my private practice, my office, I said, let me go and look at my lease and see if the lease is up. The lease was up. I downsized my practice and moved upstairs and rented space from another therapist. And I hired this woman. And I think it was one of the best things that I've ever done is to just say, I have to invest in my business. And for any entrepreneur, I think there comes a time that you have to say, I'm going to do what I need to do in order to live my purpose, my calling, and to make this business work.
I love it. Now, is she still in practice? Is she still working with business owners?
Oh, yes, she is.
Yeah. Would you mind sharing her name in case someone wants to reach out to her?
Oh, no, of course. Her name is Jeannie Spiro, Spiro. And you can find her at jeanniespiro.com. I love her to pieces. As a matter of fact, we no longer work together, but when 2020 happened, I don't think she'll mind me saying this because she was just on my show and she said it. She actually became one of my clients. And she then starts saying to me, because she can't help herself because she's a coach, she's like, Terrlyn, you really need to focus on this dismantling racism. And so then we started just shaping things a little bit differently. So I anybody who wants to know how to make 6 and 7 figures, Jeannie Spiro is your person.
I love it. Absolutely. But thanks for sharing that. And we'll make sure to get her website into the show notes as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's your smartest money decision. And I can honestly say that I hired a coach here. It'll be 3 years ago. I'm in the 3rd year of a coaching program, and I've referenced my coach, and she's actually going to be on the podcast as well. And I was more of a when the student is ready, the teacher appears.
Yeah.
And I was ready. It was time, and it's been just a fantastic experience the whole time through. Let's move on to the second money question is, what was the biggest money mistake you've ever made? And tell me that story.
So I think that I don't have a huge one, but I remember once I invested some money in a program I put a down payment, and it was a substantial down payment to become this charismatic speaker because I thought I was going to join this woman's $25,000 program. But my girlfriend talked to me for 2 hours to say, you're already a charismatic speaker. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't invest money in your business, but this woman is not the person for you. This is not what you need. And so as a result of putting that money down, I couldn't get the deposit back. and I had to use it towards some other program that she had. And I remember it was something that was downloadable, and I never ever used it. So that was a couple of $1,000s that sort of went out of the window. But I think one of the other money mistakes that I would offer is this, and that is there is a point in time that I did not step fully into who I am as a spiritual leader and a psychologist, because thinking the business world, you always have to give them exactly how much money they're going to make if they work with you. And so there was a time that I probably didn't charge as much as I should have to work with people. I don't do that anymore because I know that I have the credentials of the years of schooling, all of the practice that I've done. And I just know what it's worth to me to step authentically into my calling. And so I want to help other people in whatever areas that they are in, particularly around having this conversation about becoming more racially inclusive. I know that I need to charge my worth, and I do that now. So I don't make that mistake anymore. And I want to just say to your entrepreneurs, charge what you are worth.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. We all need to every single year take a look at our pricing models, take a look at what we're charging, what we're worth, and the value we're bringing to the table, and reassess on a regular basis. So thank you for sharing that.
Can I just say one other real quick thing about that, particularly people who are very religious, because we sometimes can confuse that we shouldn't make money. We should just serve. So don't do that.
God wants us to make money too.
That's
I mean, you can't tithe zero. You got to be able to have something to give from. So God wants us to be successful as well.
That's right.
So the last money question I ask everybody is the mastering question. So what does mastering your finances mean to you?
So for me, it would mean making good choices about where to invest my money. That's one thing that I would want to do. And I want to make those choices because I want to reach business goals and personal goals. And so it's funny that you talked about we can't tithe zero. At some point in my life, I would love to become a philanthropist. And I can't do that if I don't make the money to do it. So mastering my money would be just making the choices that would get me to that goal.
Okay. The smart choices that are going to allow you to achieve your goals, that'll then allow you to then have your vision come to life.
Yes.
Of being a philanthropist.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. So there's probably one or two people who are listening to this that are like, okay, I love this lady. And by the way, for those of you who listen to the intro, it's kind of neat. Reverend Dr. Terrlyn Avery Curry, but she puts it in her information to you as TLC. I love TLC. So if anybody wants to get a hold of TLC, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you, Terrlyn?
So the best way is to go to my website at sacredintelligence.com, and you can find out how to reach me, but you can also find out information about my Dismantling Racism courses. And there's also a free download on there as well. And you'll see it all in the hyperlinks. And the free download is really about how to have those difficult conversations around racism.
Fantastic. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
I would like to share that I expect my book to come out in the fall of 2021. And the book is entitled Dismantle Racism, The Sacred Intelligence Journey of Faith. At least that's what the title is now. My editor might end up changing it.
Fantastic. Well, I would like to know when it's ready so that I can place an order and get one in. So that would be great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Terrlyn, or TLC, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I truly have enjoyed this conversation, and you're welcome back anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe. Thanks for having me.
Well, solopreneurs, I really hope you enjoyed that conversation that I had with TLC, is what I'll call her from now on. My three takeaways I really got, and I'm actually going to go with really more like 4 or 5 takeaways. But the first one was think about your sacred motive as to why you're doing what you're doing. And then your selfish mindset. What do we need to do to change that selfish mindset to open us up to more opportunities, to serve more people, to help grow our businesses and do the things that we want in this world? And then that shared movement by doing it together and sharing what we're doing and then helping other people basically get better in this world and have a better life. And it all starts with courage. It starts with the courage to take that opportunity to have those conversations and trust that you have the faith and that you have a higher power helping you through those conversations. So I really hope you enjoyed this conversation. Please go to my website and subscribe to the newsletter so that we can keep you abreast of what's going on with solopreneur money as well as my business and how we can continuously help you master your finances to create the life you want. Thanks again for listening. Have a great day.